All right, welcome everyone. This is Pastor Gabe with Soapbox Theology. Today we're continuing to look at 1 Peter chapter 2, and we're going to look at 13 through 17, a section dealing with government. Fun subject for everyone, but let me read. 13. Be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be to the emperor as supreme, or to governors as sent by him to punish those who do evil and to praise those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. Live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but living as servants of God. Honor everyone, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the emperor. So we have to understand this was written during the time when the church was under the foot of Rome, and a lot of persecution began in the late 60s towards the church. And that is around this time that Peter is writing, probably a little bit earlier, but certainly under the under Roman rule, under Caesar. And so he begins 13, subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be to emperors or as supreme. And so this is setting the stage for that Christians, followers of Christ, should be the very best citizens, rule-abiding, honoring those in authority in any civilization, in any situation, in any government. But there are limitations to this, and we'll talk about this in a second. But in general, the posture of a Christian should not be the view of rock and roll, which is, right, stick it to the man, question authority, fight the powers that be, just be a rebel. This idea, rebel without a cause, just that that is not who followers of Christ are called to be, and who should they should be. And so, in general, Christians should be followers of Christ, acknowledging that the Lord has instituted spheres of authority. Okay, the Puritans used to talk about three spheres of authority with the government at large, the church, and then the family. And I think that that's right. And so this is acknowledging the sphere of influence of the government. And in general, we are to be subject to the Lord's human institutions. Okay, whether it's the emperor, it's the institution or the emperor. And so Christians ought not to be those who are cursing the president. We might not like his policies. We should vote for someone else then. But we should not be those who are just cursing those in authority, because God tells us here to be subject to them. That's not to say you can't criticize, and especially in the American system, criticizing and addressing and trying to change and vote and put in other laws is part of our system. So it's not, we're not in violation of that because we're within the system. That's part of our human institution. But we are to be subject, and that should be our first goal. But listen to this, because the next verse helps us define these things. So some of us might be saying, well, what if our governors, emperors, presidents are completely wicked? Should the church have been subject to, the obvious example, to Hitler? Okay, this next section gives us a barometer for that. Or to governors as sent by him. Now here's what they're supposed to do, right? To punish those who do evil and to praise those who do good. So this is the role of those emperors as supreme or to governors. Their role is to punish those who do evil and praise those who do good. And so they have to have a right understanding of right and wrong, of the moral code, of what God says is right and wrong. They have to understand these things and implement these things. And when you see the magistrates, governors, mayors, presidents doing the opposite of this, then something is really wrong. And that's when the whole idea of resistance comes into play. That's when the disciples can say, We've heard you on this, but we cannot help but preach the gospel, right? When they were ordered to stop from the magistrates in their time, they said, well, whether you think this is right or wrong, let God decide, but we cannot but help preach the gospel. And so in that moment, it's like when you're trying to tell us to not preach the gospel, to not follow Christ, you are no longer punishing those who are evil, you're trying to punish those that are doing good. And so you can notice that the system has been flipped on its head. So these are no longer good or honorable magistrates. And so that's when the issue of resistance comes into play. But this is talking in general, if this is what they are supposed to be doing. For this is the will of God, and this, again, further teaches this point, that by doing good, you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. So, assuming you're having a system that's actually rewarding good and punishing evil, it is by your doing good that you're silencing foolishness, that you're revealing wickedness, that you're revealing, you're demonstrating that God's wisdom is best, that God's wisdom brings about truth and brings about justice. Many times in the Old Testament, the Lord points out lying and thieving and how that contributes to injustice. And so, but as we're doing the will of God, we're not being liars, we're not thieving, we're not therefore bringing about injustice. The world today doesn't have any concept of what justice is because it doesn't understand true weights and true measures. It doesn't understand good and evil. It doesn't understand the role of the government is only to suppress evil and to reward good. It doesn't understand any of these things, and this is why we're seeing increasing governments that don't get it, why we're seeing increasing lawlessness just running rampant in the land, which is really, really sad because it's exactly this. The governors, the mayors are telling the police not to enforce laws, not to protect citizens. They're allowing evil to just sort of multiply on the streets, and they're coming down on the people that are upset about this, that can see that laws are being violated, that can see that justice is not being held, can see that unequal weights and measures are being applied. When they're allowing wicked men to just turn around, they're being free, they're allowed to go, they're not being prosecuted. And then when Christians come along and say, hey, you ought not to be doing these sorts of things, those people are getting arrested. And this is sadly happening in our land today. So the will of God is we do what's right because we know what's right, hoping that our magistrates are those who will praise what is good. But when they're not, then you have a corrupt system. So as Christians live, as we honor these systems that God has put in place, we are putting to silence the ignorance of foolish men. Okay, but it might not be the case if we're under judgment, and this is the argument of Romans 1. Sometimes God gives people over to what ultimately ends up being insanity because they are ignoring the way that God has taught them and called them to live. So verse 16, live as people who are free. Okay, live as people who are free. So you understand you're ultimately accountable to God. You're living in such a way to bring about the testimony of what is good and what is righteous, and to shed light on what is ignorant and foolish. So we're free before God, but we're not using our freedom as a cover-up for sin. And that's what's happening in our culture today. Freedom, more and more people are appealing to the concept of freedom, but they're using it for lawlessness. This is why free speech is today is defending lewdness, is defending grooming in our schools, is defending sexual immorality on the streets, right? Public acts of indecency, lewdness, even nudity. But we're celebrating these things in the name of tolerance, in the name of pride. But see, that's an example of people using, quote, freedom to cover up evil. And Christians are not supposed to do this. We're supposed to always walk in the standard that brings honor to the Lord. Because we understand ultimately we're servants of Christ. And that's why we're free, because he's our ultimate allegiance, ultimately the one that we're living to honor. And then 17, honor everyone, love the brotherhood, fear God, and again, honor the emperor. So we're supposed to be honoring the emperor, going back to my beginning place. Now, we can be upset with the emperor, we can not like his policies, and then that's why we should be able to vote them out, assuming, that system is still functioning properly without corruption. But I want to read, this is because 1 Peter 2 here and Romans 13 are really the two big sections, at least in the New Testament, that are getting at these principles. So Romans 13, so that one was Peter. Paul writes more or less the same principle, and he's also bringing out the ways that we define these things. So Romans 13:1, let every person be subject to governing authorities, For there's no authority except from God, and those exist that have been instituted by God. So that's the command. Do whatever the government tells you. Yes, unless, and here's the point, or sorry, 2. Therefore, whoever resists his authority resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. And that is absolutely true. Going back to our other section, that's why Christians ought to be the best citizens in any kingdom, in any state, in any government. But here's the point. So why did people ever resist? Why did the apostles say, no, we're going to preach the gospel, right? Why was it unjust that many times Paul was imprisoned for preaching the gospel and he was appealing to the authorities? Why wasn't he just sitting there and let them abuse him, essentially? Here's why. This section has the same clarification on what these magistrates are supposed to be doing. So there's an assumption that these are from God, therefore the way that they operate are defined by God. And so we'll see this. 3, for rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. That's definitional. Rulers are supposed to be a terror to bad conduct, not good. And if that's true, then when an officer pulls you over and they say, let me see your, you say, yes, sir. Absolutely, sir. How can I cooperate, sir? Okay. We all knew this 5 years ago, but there's increasing resistance to even the police because the police have been undermined. And so, but I don't think, I would say it's very rare when a Christian should be fighting against that. But we're seeing increasingly where police essentially are being assigned and they're acting as thugs because that's what they're being told by their mayors and governors. Don't prosecute wickedness, prosecute those that are trying to point out the wickedness. And so this is being flipped on its head. Rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. When that's not true, something is really, really wrong in your society. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. Are you seeing this? For he is God's servant for your good. So if he is God's servant for your good, then when you do good, you shouldn't have any fear. But if you have fear for doing good, then there's something wrong here. This servant might actually be someone who's given to the people for judgment. That's the argument at the beginning of Romans. So if this is not working, if this is backwards, then your system is corrupt. And you could be under judgment, very likely. And then that's when the discussions of what does resistance come in. Now, Christian is never given to armed resistance. That's not what we're called to do. We're called to suffer in silence. We're called to suffer graciously. We're called to suffer mercifully, crying out to God for our deliverance. It doesn't mean I become a vigilante or anything like that. Okay. This is just concepts of just war aside, and that's not what we're looking at today. This is simply talking about our responsibility in responding to the governors and the magistrates. So normally, if they're operating on the level of God's minister and not someone who's there as judgment, then normally you would be able to do good and you would be rewarded for do good. Okay? Here's the other flip side to that. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is a servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Again, this is the ideal situation. This is the way God set it up. This is the way it's supposed to happen. Police are supposed to be arresting the bad guys. When someone breaks into your home and you defend yourself and you kill the bad guy, they should be saying, good job defending your family, not dragging off the person who defended their family. And we're seeing this increasingly where the perpetrator, the criminal, is being defended and giving them more rights, and the victims, actual victims, are being hauled off in the court. Something is wrong in that system. Because, again, God put these magistrates in place to be avengers on actual wickedness. So this goes back to the earlier discussion. You have to know right and wrong. Therefore, one must be in subject not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. So God's wrath follows when you are acting wickedly and getting punished by those that rightly understand right and wrong. I wouldn't say that wrath follows. I wouldn't say wrath was in store for the disciples and the apostles when they're fighting against the government, because at that point the government is in the wrong. Therefore, one must be in subject not only for to avoid God's wrath, but also for conscience sake. And again, this is why we ought to be, if possible, the best citizens. For because of this you also pay taxes, for authorities are minister of God attending to this very thing. And that brings up a different discussion there, which we're not looking at in Peter. We are to pay taxes, but if the government has become corrupt, right? I mean, this is the whole Robin Hood situation. And I wouldn't say that he was necessarily in the wrong there, maybe the way he was going about it. But the idea of addressing a corrupt system, this is saying, I mean, the idea of paying taxes follows when your magistrates are rightly doing what they ought to do. So this is a whole other situation. We're not going to get into that today. But this says, pay to what is owed them, taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whose respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed. So there's a point where this sort of thing breaks down, okay? I can honor the office that they're holding, but I can also understand this is not a good person and figure out other ways to address that situation. But the same thing with taxes. And so I actually think that this would mean at some point respect and honor also breaks down, but it's for the office. But I still think we should err on the side of honor and respect. Even Paul and the apostles showed honor and respect when those in office weren't doing what's right. They weren't cursing them out, right? Even when Paul was speaking and and he was rebuked by the Sanhedrin, like, is this how you talk to the high priest? And he immediately says, no, the Bible says you're not to curse your leaders. You're supposed to speak to your leaders in the right way. And he basically backpedals, right? I didn't know he was the high priest when I was speaking. So honor and respect is a little bit different in that I can still show these things whether my allegiance has to be different, because now I need to follow God. He's the one that this also ultimately comes from. So 1 Peter 2 and Romans 13 really get at this idea of law and government and the believer's responsibility. So at best, we are to honor one, and I think as a Christian we always show honor and respect, but we are free to disagree when it's appropriate, and we certainly should point out when they're not doing good but evil. In fact, who else could point that out except Christians who have a higher standard to God? And so it is important that we speak up, and this is how this is historically many times how martyrs have been made, as churches trying to do the right thing end up getting on the wrong side of the government. And sadly, we're increasingly seeing that in our day, and we need so much prayer in this area because we have to rely on the Lord's strength, while we're attempting to honor His word. And so we need to honor His word as much as possible, as often as possible, laying down our lives even to the point of death. So that's this section. It's hard. It's very applicable for today. This is something that we all have to pray about deeply and figure out ways to do this and to address a nation that is increasingly going wrong, is increasingly becoming dark. So we are called to be light. And so these sections are important to understand how to do so, because if we're going to be light, we have to call out what's true in the face of lies. So we'll look at the next section next time. Thank you guys so much. Bye.